Okay, excellent. So, as Lisa said, I am at Birmingham City University. If you'd like to find me on Twitter, please do. I am at Poppy Wilde. Yeah, please go and find me there. I wanted to start just by kind of giving you a bit of a background on who I am. So senior lecturer in media and communications at Birmingham City University. I work on video games as well as other forms of popular media and culture. So I also have publications on, for example, zombies, Lady Gaga and Queer Eye. Sometimes I get to overlap zombies with games. So I also have a chapter on Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare. So for anyone who is a fan of the zombie game, then you're in my gang. My work is predominantly focused on critical post-humanism. I'm not going to be talking about that loads today, but that's what my PhD thesis, which I started nearly 10 years ago and completed 6 years ago, was looking at. So I really focused on the relationship between the avatar and the gamer in massively multiplayer online role-playing games. So my research was an autoethnography. My PhD research was an autoethnography of World of Warcraft. So I used autoethnography in the PhD, and therefore a variety of my publications, both arising from the PhD research and other research in other areas. You'll also see my flagrant self-promotion here, which is my first monograph, Post-Human Gaming, Avatars, Gamers and Entangled Subjectivities, which is published in September through Routledge. Obviously, I'm sure all of you will be delighted to spend 130 of your own pounds on this book, but should that not be an option, if you are interested, please do recommend it to your librarian. So yeah, that was a joke. I'm obviously not expecting anyone to spend 130 pounds on it. So I'm going to talk today about kind of what autoethnography is, and then I'm going to kind of talk through how it works in games, how I've used it in games, and then hopefully we're going to have a little bit of a play. If anyone's got any questions, obviously, please just pop up at any time, because I might not be able to see. I can't see the chat at the moment, so do just let me know. Okay, so autoethnography is basically a kind of response to leaving out certain experiences and feelings from the research projects, whatever they might be. So in their book Networked Effect, in their edited collection, Personen, Hillis and Pettit say the textual turn downplays the material, the embodied and the sensory in studies of culture and society. And so autoethnography is one of a variety of methods that really try to respond to this downplaying by bringing those kind of emotions, affects and experiences back into the picture. So autoethnography follows on from the crisis of representation, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, in terms of that kind of period of thinking where researchers sort of realized that representation isn't objective, it isn't unbiased. There are problematic, sometimes power relations, and certainly in ethnographies, historically, there have been very problematic power relations between the researcher and the researched. There are issues in terms of languages that are used to convey different representations. And so autoethnography kind of follows on from this kind of crisis of questioning what is our research doing, who are we speaking to and for, what does objectivity mean anyway, and what's kind of possible within research. So Carolyn Ellis, so there's a few kind of main people that I would say you should sort of keep an eye out for in autoethnography, and Carolyn Ellis is like the biggest one. So Carolyn Ellis often writes with her partner Arthur Bochner, and they also co-author quite often with Tony Adams. And in this piece from 2010, Ellis, Bochner, and Adams say that autoethnography is one of the approaches that acknowledges and accommodates subjectivity, emotionality, and the researcher's influence on research, rather than hiding from these matters or assuming they don't exist. So another thing that I think is super important when we talk about autoethnography is to understand that it's a feminist methodology, and an intersectionally feminist methodology, because it's really working on bringing the body, affect, feelings, and emotions back into the picture. If we think about how that is responding to a particular not only the crisis of representation, but really a very historically patriarchal and white and colonial knowledge structure, what we see through history in terms of the kind of division between gendered ideologies is very much this idea that, men are rational, they are reasonable, they can be objective and intelligent and clever, and women are then sort of sidelined to the hysterical, the emotional, the kind of passionate and emotive, unreasonable beings. Same as, say, in terms of races, where we think about how, again, historically, that kind of same logic was used to oppress and discriminate against different peoples of color, where anything that was kind of didn't conform to the sort of Western ideal of again, that kind of reasonable, rational behavior was seen as a threat or seen as uncultured and lower in the hierarchy. So from that perspective, autoethnography is bringing body, bringing affect, bringing feelings, bringing emotion back into the picture, is feminist, both from the perspective of taking feelings and experiences that have historically been relegated to being seen as unreasonable, unscientific, and unproductive, and bringing those back into acknowledging that our experience is a form of knowledge, that our emotions are a form of knowledge. And as I say, that kind of operates across a variety of different kind of binaries or imposed binaries. So I think it's very important that people understand it from that perspective, that if you're using autoethnography, you should understand that kind of philosophy of where that research is coming from. It acknowledges that partiality of knowledge as well, and it acknowledges that subjective experience is what we form our knowledge from, and it's very reflexive. So again, we've got this kind of idea of what are we kind of doing here. So autoethnography just literally kind of as personal culture writing. So you're looking for, how does my experience, how do my personal experiences inform me and others about cultures, about peoples, about societies, and about behaviors through the way that I write that. There's this kind of focus on rich, thick description, which again, anyone who's done ethnographies will also be familiar with that idea of rich, thick description to sort of evoke a particular kind of sense of being there, being in that space, in that culture, in that community, whatever particular kind of object is at study. The writing element of autoethnography is therefore also kind of looking at accessible forms of knowledge. And again, understanding that because something is accessibly written and evocatively written doesn't mean it's any less valuable, less clever, or that there's any kind of hierarchy in terms of the kind of complex writing versus accessible texts, which again, the accessibility of autoethnographies is very much, again, kind of rooted in that feminist methodology of wanting to open research out, and not just kind of contain it within this sort of elitist academe, but to really allow people to access that knowledge in that evocative way. Moving away, as I said, from the study of culture being externally based. So historically, as I said, with ethnographies, there are often these kind of problematic images where you'll see a white man photographed next to people of colour in particular tribes or regions or communities. And it's very much this kind of outsider coming in and looking at what people are doing, noting behaviours for their oddness, for their difference, and having that kind of that sort of external bias. Autoethnographies are about thinking about our own research, our own environments, our own cultures, and our own communities, and bringing that insider knowledge, rather than looking at other people's behaviors as strange, looking at how do our cultures and our societies and our behaviors, how are they, if we make the familiar strange, how might we kind of be able to allow other people to understand our experiences and our cultures, through opening up our own experience. So autoethnographies, quote from myself, are about bringing personal lived experience, rigorous cultural analysis, and emotive forms of representation together in research in order to create accessible text. So again, these kind of key things here. Personal lived experience still needs to have that rigorous cultural analysis, and one of the things that I'm going to be talking about shortly is kind of the point of autoethnographies. Those emotive forms of representation, again, are about how we can convey knowledge and share knowledge through emotion and through shared affect and networked affect, and feeling. And again, doing that in a way that creates accessible texts, that opens that discussion out. So autoethnography in games is a bit of a weird one, shall we say, just because reflexive ethnographies in video gaming is a really kind of well established research methodology. So ethnographies being that kind of participant observation, going into a game or a game community, participating with the community, observing how others behave. And that might also include things like kind of taking field notes about the different spaces that are occupied, the behaviours that are seen in others, as well as potentially things like interviews, and more kind of dialogues, those sorts of things. So a lot of ethnographies occur in game studies, either within game spaces themselves or within game communities. And there's a lot of reflexivity in many of those, where authors are kind of incorporating their own experiences in some way and providing their own sort of commentary. But often the actual kind of idea of a full autoethnography in games seems to be sort of shied away from. Some people have used the term microethnographies with kind of small groups and maybe just a pair. And collaborative autoethnographies also work in that way, where there's kind of a few researchers. But autoethnography still has that kind of participant observation. You are still a participant in that culture, in that community, and you're still observing, but there's more of that personal focus on observing your own experiences and your own feelings, and again, kind of acknowledging those as valid forms of research. So the three books that I've got the covers of here, My Life as a Night Elf Priest, an anthropological account of World of Warcraft by Bonnie Nardi, Play Between Worlds, Exploring Online Game Culture by T.L. Taylor, and Communities of Play, Emergent Cultures in Multiplayer Games and Virtual Worlds by Celia Pearce and Artemisia, are 3 superb texts, which anyone who's interested in kind of ethnographies of games and game worlds, I would highly recommend. Notable Celia Pearce and Artemisia. Artemisia is Celia Pearce's avatar from her research. So when you see Pearce and Artemisia as co-authors, that's because Celia Pearce has shared that authoring with her avatar and acknowledges that in that way. There are other kind of notable sort of exceptions. One of my favorite, one of my kind of inspiration pieces, I suppose, is Desires at Play on Epistemological Uncertainty by Jenny Sundin, and that's again that's an article, that's an excellent piece. But in general, as I say, whilst it's very widely acknowledged in games research that playing games is valid research, Espen Aarseth has written about this in his work on playing in methodological ways. That Aarseth kind of writes about how if we haven't played a game, we are potentially liable to misunderstand things when undertaking games research, and so playing the game gives you that kind of insight. But as I say, a lot of kind of work that utilizes reflexivity in ethnographies tends to shy away a little bit just from kind of calling itself outright an autoethnography. But I would say there are lots of autoethnographic elements across a variety of games research. So what do you actually do? So autoethnographies kind of start in the same way as sort of ethnography does, in terms of a deep immersion in a particular culture. As say, the idea with an autoethnography is that you're thinking about your own culture and your own sort of experiences. You then have this reflexive consideration of how that context affects the researcher. You're gathering field notes and analysing these, but there are many different types of autoethnographies and they can look very different. So when you're kind of first kind of engaging in your immersion, which is a problematic word all round, but we'll use it for today. When you're kind of looking for that immersion in a particular culture, it's about either being, there's many different ways of doing this, right? So depending on what your research is looking for, you might be doing an autoethnography of playing a particular game, or it might be being involved in video game communities. It doesn't have to just be playing a video game. It can also be, like I say, being part of a gaming community, whether that's a gaming community online through a kind of digital methods and means, or whether that's about, attending particular kind of communities. But you've got that kind of being in a particular culture and potentially a particular space, even if that's a digital space. What you're then kind of thinking about is there still needs to be this kind of overarching purpose to what you're trying to achieve. So it's not an autoethnography of games isn't just, or of any context, isn't just kind of how does this make you feel. So it's not just how did this game make you feel. There should still be particular guiding principles. As with all research, it's fine to kind of branch out from your guiding principles, from your initial questions or kind of purpose. But in the same way as you think about any kind of data collection in research, you should be thinking about having some kind of idea of what you're doing. So if you think about if you were undertaking interviews, for example, if you were doing semi-structured interviews, you have a set of kind of questions or points or topics that you want to hit, that you want to kind of talk about and focus on. You don't want to be so restricted to those things that if your interviewee, if your participant said something else that was really interesting, you want to be able to follow that path. You want to kind of go down that route. You want to have things open enough to be surprised. And it's exactly the same in a kind of autoethnography. You should have those kind of guiding principles, that kind of initial purpose, that sort of idea of what you're looking for, but allow yourself to be surprised as well. So one of my things with my research was that I was actually surprised by the things that in my PhD research that I wasn't writing down. So I realized at one point that when, for example, I was getting bored of playing a game, I wasn't writing about that, and I wasn't writing about things like having a snack while I was playing a game, or like texting people while playing a game, because in some way that hadn't kind of blocked itself to me as being sort of data. But actually it was, and it was a really significant thing of understanding that games are still things that we get bored of. They are still things that we multitask through, and that we navigate game spaces, in the same way that we kind of navigate physical spaces, in terms of our attention being split in different ways. So you still want to have that kind of openness, but there should still be a purpose for what you're sort of looking for. In terms of then gathering field notes and what you're actually doing, people gather notes in different ways. So scratch notes is one way of doing it, of kind of making quick notes that you then sort of go away and write up. Some people will pause whilst playing a video game to write up their notes, and so there'll be kind of some sections of gameplay, and then they'll pause and write things up, and there's kind of that sort of back and forth. Some people find that is too disruptive to the game experience. So I'm talking here about if people are conducting ethnographies and writing about things, it's the kind of the same principles of, again, you can kind of write scratch notes, you can do pause and play. So there are also possibilities for sort of narrating your experience. Obviously, there's also the kind of potential of gathering other resources, including things like screenshots and screen grabs, any kind of transcripts of conversations that have been had, those sorts of things. And then in terms of the analysis of those, you're looking for themes. You're kind of looking to link that to that kind of rigorous cultural analysis that I mentioned earlier. There are a variety of different ways of doing autoethnographies. So evocatively written autoethnographies, as I say, often create a whole narrative story. If you're interested in autoethnography, then if you look at Carolyn Ellis's The Ethnographic Eye, the whole book is written as a kind of narrative, but it's a narrative of a class on autoethnography. So she then incorporates different characters who are sort of montage characters from people who she actually knew and taught. So some really kind of go for that that kind of narrative, evocative style of writing. Some are more analytical. So I think it's Anderson writes about analytical autoethnography, which can be kind of, I've said analytical can be more theoretical, but it's really about the different ways that they're integrated. But as I say, autoethnographies can look very different. And so really what you're trying to do is shed light through experience. And again, thinking about this, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to say? If it's about, this game makes me feel this way, it still needs to be thinking about what's the purpose of that for your audience? How do you want your audience to feel? What do you want people to understand from this experience? So from that perspective, feelings, experiences, effects, and emotions are all data, and data still needs curating. It can be curated in evocative narrative formats. It can be curated in kind of analytical, not that evocative narrative isn't analytical, but it can be kind of dealt with in maybe more traditional ways of kind of data collection and analysis. But it still needs to be worked with, basically, and you do that kind of through the writing. So what I've done is I worked with kind of guiding principles. I took scratch notes, I did a full write-up, and then I did coding and thematic analysis. So my kind of guiding principles were sort of initially in my PhD research many moons ago, were kind of thinking about what was the relationship between the avatar and the gamer. So that was my sort of particular focus. So I was looking at the lived experience of gaming, the affective experiences between avatar and gamer, the embodiment of that relationship. That was kind of what I was initially looking for. And then as my work kind of, as the research continued, those sort of themes started to sort of stand out. So I would write short scratch notes during play, where I would just like write a really kind of quick note to sort of remind myself of what had happened. But continue playing, because for me, I was very kind of conscious of wanting to play a game as a game, and sort of still have that gamer subjectivity meshed with my researcher subjectivity. So then after a particular gameplay session, I would look at the little scratch notes, little short notes that I'd made, and then I would do the full write-up immediately after playing. And that would allow me to then have that rich, thick description. I was drawing on the memory of the moment and my kind of affective experience of that. I then used Evernote, but obviously, people use things like NVivo, for example, to put all of my field notes into, and then tagged each of my field notes with different kind of themes, and looked at that kind of coding there. And then I employed a thematic analysis. So I'm going to give you an example of a written up field note from my work, and hopefully you'll kind of see how that works. How it works. So this is my avatar, a team on the right hand side here, from World of Warcraft. A team completely pisses me off in this moment. We are diligently keeping watch, making sure there are no enemy players coming to attack us or kill us as we attempt to claim these territories. I am engrossed in my own guarding of the landscape and in the affection I am feeling towards my pet, whose stern gaze seems to match that of mine. Suddenly, I notice that a team is displaying the usual signs that she does when left unattended. This time, rather than seeing her behaviour as an alluring aloofness, which I know is an act, I am frustrated with her. We are waiting, diligent and alert, on edge and present in the moment, ready for attack. Yet her physical presence reflects none of this. Her body is bored, and I'm annoyed. I tap the keyboard to move her, to shake her out of this state. So this note, again, as you can see, does demonstrate a particular affective moment, a particular feeling of frustration and annoyance. And then in terms of my research, this was really interesting because I was looking at the relationship of the avatar and the gamer in this kind of post-human way, thinking about how that subjectivity emerges from the entanglement of avatar and gamer. Yet this note actually was very much a kind of a demonstration of me wanting to have sort of humanistic control over a team, me not being happy with how her embodiment was kind of empathetically aligned with my own. And so this was a particular kind of moment which allowed me as a researcher to reflect on how, even when looking for particular things and particular kind of emergent subjectivities, there are still moments that displaced that kind of expectation and still displaced that sort of that idea that the avatar and the gamer are this kind of entanglement. This note kind of showed how much I was still feeling like I wanted to control the avatar, which is exactly kind of what I'm sort of what posthumanism and the way that I use posthumanism in gaming is kind of moving against. Yeah, so that was me being annoyed at my avatar. So some key things to remember when doing an autoethnography, I would say, are to think about purpose. What are you looking for? What does your experience show? Think about it being evocative. How are you using language and description to allow your reader to feel what you're feeling, to understand your experience and gain knowledge and understanding from it? How is it relatable? There needs to be enough description to provide context, or at least to kind of intrigue people. So if you think about this note here, where I'm kind of saying, we're diligently keeping watch, making sure there are no enemy players coming to attack us or kill us as we attempt to claim these territories. I'm providing enough context there for you to understand what's going on in this moment. But there also needs to have some sense of meaning. So what are we doing with that? So like I say, what does this tell us about those relationships? So as I say, what I then kind of went on to sort of analyze with this particular field note was, as I say, that kind of the ways in which different subjectivities emerge in different ways, and how this demonstrates, as I say, that kind of desire for me to have that kind of empathetic reflection of my feelings through a team's body language, and then my frustration that I didn't have that. Demonstrating, as I say, that kind of element of humanistic control and wanting to control the avatar, which I then did by tapping the keyboard to move her, to so-called shake her out of this state. So you, like I say, that there needs to be that kind of sense of meaning there in what you're doing. And again, that goes for that kind of so what. Like any data, we don't just let it speak for itself. We do that curation of that data, whether that's curation, as I say, in that kind of evocative narrative way, whether that's in terms of kind of breaking from, well, here's a field note into here's my analysis of it, which is what I did in this article, which is open access if you're interested. And so either way, there needs to be that kind of guiding your reader and your audience through. So what does this tell us? What does this experience tell us? What do these feelings tell us? What is that doing? So hopefully that's given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour on autoethnography. What I would like us to do now is spend about 15 minutes playing some games. So not 15 minutes, sorry, 10 minutes. So what I've got here, and I will paste these into the chat bar for those online, are 4 different free-to-play online short browser-based games. If you are on mobile, if you don't have a laptop with you, then you can play the female CW one. Just realised I've not put the titles on here. So there are 4 different games. It's totally up to you which one you kind of want to play. I've given you a kind of guiding question, but again, remember that that's just for the kind of purposes of, I want you to spend 10 minutes sort of playing this game, thinking about this guiding question, also thinking about, well, how does that make me feel? How does the game make me feel? What other things are coming up which might deviate from this kind of guiding question? And then we're going to have a go at kind of writing up some feelings and sort of sharing. So 4 different games. Gods Will Be Watching. If you play Gods Will Be Watching, just make sure that you kind of scroll down enough in your screen. If you're on laptop, it's starts further down the screen, as it were. Female Crime World, which, as I say, if you're on mobile, it will pop up and say it's not optimized for mobile, but you can play that on mobile. Lost Smokes and Good Impression. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I will put that back up in just a second, but I'm just going to do that so that I can share this with the people in the chat. So, like I say, 4 different games. Gods Will Be Watching is there, and that's your guiding question. Female crime mod, totally up to you which one you watch, which one you play. They may include, well, female crime mod definitely includes strong language. Lost Smokes does have kind of a focus on sentimentality and sort of nostalgia. Good Impression has at the end of it some quite frenetic sound. So if you have hearing problems or issues, you might want to avoid that one. I don't think any of them have any other kind of content warnings. So it is now, according to my clock, 10:34. So, oh, it's just 10:35. So if we have 10 minutes, I'll leave these up on the screen. If one doesn't take your fancy, move on to another one. Same, if one doesn't work, and just kind of bear that guiding question in mind, but also be sort of responsive. If you're online, I would say stay on Teams, and then I'll in 10 minutes I'll tell you that 10 minutes is up, and then we'll have the next bit. Is that okay? Any questions? Anything not clear there? We all good? All good in the room, Lisa? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone say anything's wrong. And I can see you've said all good. Yes, sorry, as Lisa has said, you need to include the capitals when you type it in. So the short links there are bit.ly/, and then we've got Gods WBW, so capital G for Gods, capital W, capital B, capital W, bit.ly/ female with a capital F, capital C, capital W for Female Crime World, bit.ly/ capital L for Lost and capital S for Smoke, and bit.ly/ capital G Good and capital I Impress. So I'll call us all back at 10:45. Obviously, if anyone's got any questions in the meantime, please just pop anything in the chat or unmute in the room.